Good afternoon. My name is Romina Pacheco. I use she, her, ella pronouns. Ella is in Spanish. I am the Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging at the Windward School. I've been at Windward I'm on my fourth year at Windward. And before Windward, I have worked in education inside and outside of the classroom for about 20 years. No, actually, more of that, like 25 years. And part of what I'm bringing today to this webinar is the experience that I've had, as a teacher, as a classroom teacher, and also as an administrator nowadays that works with teachers, supporting them in thinking through the process of creating space for all students, right? Like the title of this presentation today is really thinking and inviting us to consider how do we engage every learner, right? How do we think about the materials that we are using in the classroom in order to include everyone, right? That it's in front of us. All right, so if you let me tell you a couple of logistic things about our Zoom engagement today, our webinar. There are two options for you to communicate with me and to a degree with each other. We have the chat open, and in the chat you have two options. You have one option to communicate with everyone, so you can type in the chat for everybody, and everybody who is here with us today will be able to read what you type there. There's also an option to communicate only with me. With the panelists, and there's also another option for you to submit questions. So it's a Q&A section that you can also click to submit your questions or comments that will only be visible to the panelists and moderators here today. So you have three options to communicate, okay? Feel free to use any of them at any point. And if you are able to, I know some people might be on their phone during their commute, but if you're able to type in the chat, what brought you to this webinar today? What caught your attention about it? When you read the title, right, Engage Every Learner, Evaluating Instructional Materials for Inclusion, what made you just make that decision, like, oh, I'm going to register for this today? So if you can just type that in a few words, I would really appreciate it. I'll read it as we go. Okay, so for today's agenda, we are going to essentially work on or look at three different pieces, right? The first thing that we're going to do is to start with some definitions and just make sure that we have that common ground and that common understanding around some of the terminology that we use. Then we're going to move on briefly, because we only have, an hour for all of this. So I'm briefly going to touch on the relationship between neuroscience and the EIB. And by the EIB, I mean diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And then I'm going to attempt to answer this question, right? Like, where do we start as educators? And gonna really look at the three different points with mostly an emphasis on the second one, right? The role of the materials. But we will look briefly about the role of the self, then move on to the role of the materials, where we're going to spend most of our time this afternoon. And then finally, the role of the process, right? So we have the materials, and then it's like, what do we do with the materials? And then we'll open, I'm hoping that we have the last few minutes that we have time for a Q&A. We'll do a closing and we'll go and enjoy the rest of our evening. Okay. I am going to invite you to participate in a poll now. because I'm very curious about who is in the room and where you are at. So the first question, and I'm going to open the poll in a second, but the first question for you to think about is, how often do you pay attention to identity representation in the materials you use in your work? I'm going to repeat the question. How often do you pay attention to identity representation in the materials you use in your work? And by identity representation, what I mean is race, class, gender, disability, and other identity markers, right? For example, do you pay attention to the identities of the main characters of the book? Do you pay attention to their identity and representation of the authors of the book? Think about that as I open the poll. But on a scale from 1 to 5, when 1 is never, I don't think about, the identity representation, and 5 is every single time, how often do you pay attention to the identity representation? And I want to make the assumption that most people that are joining us today are classroom teachers, but I also want to make the assumption that not everybody who is joining us today is in the classroom. So even if you're not teaching, you're not in the classroom, what about other materials that you use in your work? Like if you are part of a marketing department, for example, how do you think about this when it comes to representing the representation in the materials that you use for marketing? Well, how do you think about this when in the way other materials that you engage with for your work, even if you're not in the classroom? Okay, so I see in the based on the answers that folks have given today, that the great majority think about the representation. Some people never do, which is very, I'm going to share the results, which is not really surprising, right? I'm not surprised by these results. I think that it depends, depending on what you do. There are times when we might think about this, but other times we don't. And also, we might think about some representation, but not others, right? We might be thinking about race, but maybe we're looking at gender, for example. And this is part of why we come to spaces like this in order to learn more and think more, right? The fact that you are here today is a sign to me that you are interested in thinking about how do you increase that representation, or how do you think about it, right? How do we work with it? Now, second question is, what feelings come up for you when you think of selecting materials for your work that are inclusive? So much of coming into a space like this, like a webinar, is about the head, right? We tend to get really heady and quite academic, right, when it comes to having these kinds of conversations. But in reality, these conversations are not just about engaging our mind. It's also about engaging our bodies, our feelings, right? Our histories, and our stories. So what feelings come up for you when you think of selecting materials for your work that are inclusive? So just check with yourself for a second. I'm going to launch the poll now. And I put a few options here. I try to think what feelings could potentially come up for folks. Some of those might be reflected here for you. Some of them maybe not here. So do you feel excited about thinking about what materials you're going to use, especially if you're trying to be inclusive? Do you get anxious or nervous? Do you feel sad? Do you get angry? Do you feel embarrassed? Do you feel empowered? Or maybe some other feeling, right? There are so many feelings. These are the ones that I thought that might be the most common ones. And again, by inclusive, what I mean is thinking about the representation of our various sets of identities, right? Thinking about how am I inclusive of people of different races or different socioeconomic classes or disabilities and genders. So how do I include how do I include people who come from different backgrounds that takes into account, power dynamics, the history of oppression and privilege? What comes up for you? And the truth is that you may have different feelings at different points, right? And also that you may have different feelings based on the kind of inclusion that you're trying to do, right? I know that for me, based on my own background and experience, there are some materials that bring me lots of joy and excitement, and there are others that make me maybe embarrassed because I have to recognize that I don't know enough and that I have to do more learning. Or maybe I get anxious precisely because I don't feel competent enough or ready to teach a certain material, right? So it also will vary. But what I want to, the point of doing this is to recognize that we all have some kind of feeling, and this is it's important to take time to acknowledge that, right? As a first step, that when we are having conversations around inclusion and we're having conversations around diversity and equity, we have to engage. We have to have a more holistic approach, right? It cannot just be about the mind. We wanted to normalize that for all of us. So if you're feeling a certain kind of way, even right now, you're right where you need to be. Okay, so when one of the first really important steps towards thinking about inclusion, it's and equity and thinking about diversity, it's coming to this place of common ground, right? There are so many times that we hear buzzwords, or that we get used to even using terminology, or we hear words in the news, so when we read articles. But there are many times when we don't really have the same understanding of the word, or how we don't define the word exactly the same way that maybe the person that I'm talking to, the way they define them. So it's really important that as a first step, is that we come to this place of understanding that we are talking indeed about the same thing. So we're going to start from that, laying that foundation. The first definition that I want to highlight today is diversity. So it's not rare for us to hear terminology being used, such as diverse students, when in reality, there is not really one person that can be diverse. When we talk about diversity, we're talking about the wide range of human characteristics, right? And these are used to mark or clarify identities. So, for example, ethnicity, race, sexual orientation, gender, etc. Right? So the term is usually used as a shorthand for quantifiable statuses. So, for example, we can ask the question, does the school population reflect the region's racial diversity? So diversity is really about the group and about all of us, and who is represented, and is there a variety of human characteristics within the group. The second term that I want us to all define and make sure that we are on the same page is equity. And equity is a function of fairness, and which is different from equality. So many times we use that term equity and equality interchangeably, when in reality they are different things, right? So when we're talking about equality, we're talking about the same. And when we talk about equity, we're really talking about giving people what they need in order to reach their full potential, right? So we think about outcomes. So how can different people can reach the same outcome, get to the same outcome, and with the resources that by giving them the resources that they need, right? And that may mean that those resources are going to be distributed differently because not everybody needs the same, right? So, for example, creating a faculty mentorship program for new teachers of color in a predominantly white school. So the new white teachers may not need the same level of mentorship, or the mentorship is going to look different, right? So we might have to invest a different set of resources for the faculty of color. That is equity. Inclusion, and this one I really want to highlight, especially since we are talking today about the evaluating materials for inclusion. Inclusion is when we take every individual's experience and identity into account, right? So, for example, the schools strive to create conditions in which all are accepted, safe, supported, and affirmed. Yes. So an example of being inclusive is using gender neutral or gender inclusive language to include people of all genders in our conversations. So, for example, using words like parents as opposed to mother and father, people, students, it really includes everyone. Now, that doesn't mean that we're not going to use words like mom and dad, right? But we use those only when we are for sure know that we are talking about a person who uses those specific labels, right? But if we are, for example, having a conversation or asking questions to an entire group of people, we should always make the assumption that there are a multiplicity of genders. So we try to be inclusive of everyone. The last, the term that I would like to define for today or right now is belonging, right? So belonging is that feeling of acceptance, right? When we feel accepted, we feel respected, affirmed, and supported to both contribute and make demands of an institution. So when we think about inclusion and belonging, and I often talk about this when people ask me, they're like, isn't that the same? Well, they are definitely connected, but the difference between inclusion and belonging, or one of the differences, is that inclusion is really the responsibility of the institution. It is our duty to think about what is it that we need to do in order to include everyone. Belonging is what we feel, right? Like the person, it's like it's in some ways it's like the result of all the efforts that we make in order to be inclusive. When I feel like I belong, I feel like this school, this classroom is my space, is my place. Okay, so why then is it important to even have a webinar like this, right? To think about why do we need to evaluate materials for inclusion? So for starters, the US education system, we know this, right, from studying history, that the US education system was created to exclude. It was really a project of exclusion, right? And it was created to exclude those who have been historically marginalized. And when I say historically marginalized, I'm talking about indigenous people, Black and brown people, folks, and other folks of color, right? People with disabilities, in many instances, girls and women as well. And the educational system that we have today, it's really the legacy of that original project, right? So if we are not intentional on being inclusive, we run the risk of perpetuating that same system that was originally created to exclude. So this is why it's important for us to have that intentionality behind really everything we do. Today, we're having a more narrow focus into thinking about materials. Um, Another important point of why this is important to be intentional is that we know that teachers in the United States are mostly white and female as well. And when it comes to our student population, we know that it is increasingly becoming more ethnically and racially diverse. And you can see in this model, right, how the student population has been shifting over the years. We have a projection that by this one gets to 2029, but the projection is that by the year 2050, the majority of the country is going to be people of other races other than white, right? So when we have a population of teachers that are mostly white, but an increasing population of students being students of races other than white, we have a disparity, right, in there. And it's important information that we need to keep in mind. We also know that classroom materials rarely reflect the diversity of the population. And this is not surprising, again, given the history of the educational system in this country. It's also not surprising knowing that the majority of authors are also white, right? So it is not surprising that the classroom materials rarely reflect the diversity of the population. Again, it's also about putting that intentionality behind the materials that we choose. And why is this relevant? And why is this something that we need to emphasize? Well, we also know that implicit bias is manifested in the classroom every day. This is just one study out of many others that reflect that teachers tend to assign more blame to Black boys in classroom disruptions, and this is based on studies. Again, this is just one study. There are multiple. It starts really young. They've done studies with preschoolers where teachers have been asked to pay attention to students and what they're doing, and point out the ones that they think that is going to be most disruptive. And what tends to happen is that the teachers tend to follow and keep a closer eye on Black boys. So we know that these biases are there. One of the most dangerous aspects of these findings is that this bias is implicit. If you ask the teachers directly if they have racist views against Black boys, they are likely to say no, right? But implicitly and knowingly, right, to them, they are actually behaving to the contrary of what they believe, right? So these are the moments that really highlight to us why is it important to be intentional about being inclusive. And it can even become more dangerous when we look at the statistics associated with the school to prison pipeline, where students that are suspended or expelled for discretionary violation are nearly 3 times more likely to be in contact with juvenile justice system the following year. And if we know that, for example, looking at the previous study, that Black boys are more likely to face disciplinary actions, then it's not surprising when we see that the prison population is disproportionately Black and brown. And doing interventions like the one that we're doing today at looking and thinking critically and intentionally about what materials we use in the classroom, even though it may sound so minuscule, in some ways is an invitation and an intervention for us to disrupt this school to prison pipeline. Obviously, that is not enough. There are so many pieces of the puzzle. There are many layers and many other intervention, right? Besides just being selective, intentionally selective with the materials that we use with our students. And in the classroom and outside the classroom. There's much more than that, but this is one building block, right? That where we can concretely contribute towards disrupting the school to prison pipeline. The good news is that there are interventions, right? The statistics and the realities are very alarming. And however, there are things that we can do, right? And this is why we're here. We're here to have these conversations. So it doesn't have to be this way, right? There are concrete steps that we can take. And one way in which we can do this is by engaging culturally responsive education. Now, I'm not here to tell you everything about culturally responsive education. We don't nearly have enough time there. But again, it's if you think about it as a big puzzle, right? That create that support towards change, transformation, and really engaging every learner so they can thrive to their fullest potential. We can look at what we're talking about today as one of those pieces, right? That creates that foundation for support. Because ultimately the goal is for students to become independent learners. That is the biggest goal, is for students to become independent learners and to fulfill and to reach their fullest potential. And one framing that invites us to think about this and how to do that is culturally responsive education. When we talk about culturally responsive education, which for some people they use terminology like culturally relevant or culturally sustaining education, it refers to teaching, pedagogy, curriculum, theories, everything that we do in a school, right? Policies and practices, instructional materials that take into account culture, identities, and context throughout the educational system, right? Some of the key cultural responsive education elements include validating students' experiences and values, disrupting power dynamics that privilege dominant groups, empowering students. So when we think about how are we culturally responsive to our students that we have in front of us, the first thing that we need to think about is, do we know our students, right? How do we know them? How do we build that relationship with them in order to, to be culturally responsive, particularly for those students who have been historically marginalized, right? The groups that have been historically marginalized. Because every instruction, every educational experience is culturally responsive. There is culture in every single lesson that we engage our students in. The question is, whose culture, right? Is it the dominant culture? Are we taking into account the culture of peoples who have been historically marginalized? That is the question, right, for us to resolve. And because we value research and evidence, something that it's incredibly validating is that there is evidence that when we are culturally responsive, we can support our students' way of learning, right? We support how their brains work. So we know because of research that cultural responsive teaching and neuroscience are closely related because culture acts as a software that programs their brain's hardware. I'm going to repeat that part. Culture acts as software that programs the brain's hardware. And it helps with processing information and form relationships, right? So in other words, when we are culturally responsive, when we use culture in our classroom that reaches every student, we are helping the brains of our students to process the information better and become successful academically. So how, you may ask? Well, let's look at this. the nervous system and the brain safety threat system, right? So I'm not going to go into all the neuroscience because we don't have time here to do this, but I'm going to just summarize it by saying that in the nervous system we have constantly working the safety and threat system, right? In other words, we're trying to look out, am I safe in this environment, right? Or is this environment at this space a threat? Do I need to protect myself? So the process of neuroception is simply how our brain unconsciously detects if we are safe in our environment or not. So for many students, this safety threat system is constantly being queued up. So for example, students who have experienced trauma, constant stress, microaggressions, nonverbal slides, anything that forms our subjective definition of what feels threatening, these students are primed for release of stress hormones that make learning nearly impossible because they are constantly trying to protect themselves. So how do we prevent this? How do we deactivate this system that is constantly looking out for us, right? So we can invest that energy in learning. So it becomes imperative for us to understand how to build positive social relationships that signal to the brain a sense of physical, psychological, and societal safety, so that learning is possible. And that is where us and our students can deactivate that system and prime the brain for learning and for growth. So there is something called neuroplasticity, and in essence, what it means is that the brain is malleable, right, and is highly plastic. So we have the ability as educators to help our students build that fluid intelligence. So let's get a little bit more specific, right? What we also want to be talking about here is how many students, especially students of color, students with disabilities, students with psychiatric or trauma histories, can be significantly disadvantaged in the classroom setting, as we understand that some brains become positioned to sit in a state of perceived threat, which then negatively impacts attention. So the goal here is to really break with that cycle, right? And get to that point of relaxation so we can support the nervous system in being primed for learning. So what we need to do is to offer opportunities for students to develop these cognitive skills and habits of mind that prepare them for more advanced academic tasks. Now, how do we do this? Where do we begin? And this is where we start looking at, the concrete steps that we can take towards creating environments for safety, right? For our students to be able to, their brains to be primed to welcome the new information and to reach those higher level of thinking. There are three points where we should really consider here when we're thinking about how to be culturally responsive. The first one is the role of the self, the second one is the role of the materials, and the third one is the role of the process. I'm going to highlight today the role of the materials, but it would be at the service if I didn't at the very least mention the role of the self, right? So first and foremost, as teachers and educators, we need to do anything we can to develop self-awareness, because how are we going to expect to engage our students if we don't first know deeply who we are, right? So some questions that we can consider for ourselves as educators in this role of the self is, what have I done to understand how I make sense of the way I act and think and talk And what are my cultural frames of reference? In other words, are you aware of what your culture is? How do you think? What are your values? Where do you stand in when it comes to power dynamics? Where's your positionality? And also, what have I done to understand how I make sense of the way my students act and think and talk? And what are their cultural frames of reference? Do I have enough understanding of what those are for me, and how are those similar to my students, and how do they differ from my students? Um, Something that we need to consider is the different levels of culture that exist. I think we tend to focus many times on that surface culture, right? Like the art and songs and the food and the language, which are all lovely, and those are can be really good entry points to connecting and learning about people's cultures, our own culture and other people's culture. But we know that just staying at the surface culture has very little impact on emotional trust. And what we really want to get to is to that deeper, high emotional aspects of culture that impact our relationships with our students. So we need to get to that shallow culture and that deep culture, right? When we talk about deep culture, we think about things like decision making, right? How do different cultural groups make decisions? What kind of different values they folks have in regards to the concepts of self? And notice that in the deep culture, there is the notions of fairness. That is where we get to build those solid, strong relationships that then will help us develop strong, trusting relationships with the students that then we will know how to support them in 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 learning, right? In again, deactivating the system where they are constantly trying to assess if they are safe. But one way in which we are also going to notice that and learn that is by starting with ourselves. Because once you have that clarity about where you are, then it becomes easier to notice the differences with other people, right? We stop making those assumptions that what other people value are the same things that I value. Now, this brings us to the role of the material. When we think about the role of the materials, right, and the materials that we're going to be using to, again, to create those bonds and develop that sense of that will support developing that sense of trust and developing the sense of trust with the goal again of supporting our students in priming their brains and their nervous system for learning so that they can become independent learners and they can reach their full potential, right? Again, you're going to hear me repeat that several times because that is the ultimate goal of doing this. And this is one of those stepping stones, right, in heading in that direction. So the first thing that we need to ask ourselves is like, is the timing of this appropriate? Is the timing for us to read this book, to engage in this concept, to watch this video appropriate for my students, for the class, for their development, right? Is this the right time of the academic year? Do they have all the elements that they need to have? Are we scaffolding it? Have I scaffolded this enough for them to be able to engage with this material and be able to receive it in a way that supports their growth and learning, right? So that is the first question that we need to ask ourselves. And the answer is going to depend on how you know your students and what you know that they're able to receive. And if the answer is no, then the question becomes, when will it be the right time? And what are the things that I have to do in order to get there? What is the background knowledge that I need to support them in creating, right? Um, Do I have to engage with very difficult and very hard concepts and history and emotionally charged concepts or readings at the very beginning of the school year? Or do I wait until the middle of the school year after we've built rapport and relationship and I've gotten to know them better and I know how much they can take? Or what else do I need to create around that safety net in order to support my students? The other question is, what are my goals with sharing this with my students, with reading this book, with reading this article, with presenting this image or watching this video? Don't lose sight of the goal and the skill or the concept that you're trying to support your students in learning. I used to work with this group of adolescents in a high school, and we were trying to teach them the skills around dialogue and debate, right? The difference between dialogue and debate, with the goal of supporting them in acquiring more dialogic skills, right? How do they communicate and have difficult conversations and remain engaged in the dialogue? And early on, when we were trying to teach them the skills for listening and just having conversations and summarizing, empathizing, etc., it would have been a mistake to start having those engaging the students if we had just picked like a really controversial topic to begin with, right? The goal was to teach them the skill, not to have difficult conversations yet. That was the ultimate goal later. In the moment, it was to focus on the skills. So what did we do? We talked about how did they communicate? How do they listen? How do they summarize? By having conversations about Oreos. So it sounded really silly, right? But again, the goal was the skill, not the topic. So something that was low stakes, because the goal was to get them to the skill. Once they had acquired the skill and they had a strong relationship as a group, then we could introduce the controversial topics, right? The hot topics that would allow, they were ready to have the difficult conversation and be able to still remain intact as a group because they had already acquired the skills. So that's one of the questions that we need to ask. What is my ultimate goal here? So is my group ready to receive this kind of information yet? And if not, then let me focus on this skill building until then we can continue to have these conversations that might be more emotionally charged, for example. Another question that we can ask is, how are my materials, who is represented in my materials? And who are they leaving out? Am I creating mirrors for my students that I have in front of me? Can they see themselves reflected in the material? And if they do, how are they seeing themselves reflected in the material? Am I creating windows for those students who might not be part of a particular group, but that it's important for them also to learn about other experiences and other groups? So even just taking a pause and paying attention to that, it's something that questions that we need to ask when we're thinking about selecting the materials. There are some tools that we can use in order to tally what we are sharing with our students, right? Because sometimes, because of implicit bias or because the amount of details that teachers have to pay attention to, it's easy sometimes to miss or not pay attention to the different communities that are being represented in the materials that we're using without realizing. Or perhaps we are heavily focusing on one group versus the other, or perhaps we might be representing one group always under the same lens. So for example, are we using representation of students of color? Perhaps we're doing a good job at exposing our students to the representation of people of color, but maybe the representation is always in the role of suffering or the role of being the receivers of oppression. So are we having representation of people of color in also in spaces of joy and empowerment, or always in that position of victimhood? And one of the tools that I really like and that I encourage teachers and educators to use is the Cultural Responsive English Language Arts Curriculum Scorecards. And these are free. You can do a simple Google search and they will pop up and you can download them. So that is one of the benefits of these scorecards. And what they do is that they provide a tool for teachers and educators to really keep a tally and really look at what if the materials are culturally responsive, if they are really supportive of creating those mirrors for our students, and if they are really supporting the creation of spaces, again, where the students can grow and learn in an environment that doesn't feel stressful for them. And one of the aspects of these scorecards that it's really powerful is that they were developed in collaboration between parents, students, educators, and researchers. Here is an example of how these culturally responsive curriculum scorecards work. So they look at three different aspects. One is the diversity of the authors. The other one is the diversity of the characters, and they also looked at the social justice orientation, and finally they evaluate the teachers' materials and see what kind of materials the teachers have and supports to teach the books, right? Or the articles or whatever materials that they're sharing with their students. So you can see how the teachers can look at the books that they're teaching and do a tally and pay attention. Am I omitting certain groups? Or am I heavily focusing too much on one versus the other? What about the social justice orientation? Am I always presenting, again, maybe people with disabilities in roles that are where they are disempowered? Or maybe they are the villain and the bad person all the time? Are they in that role of victimhood? What about the teacher's materials? Do the teachers are getting the support that they need in order to teach the content of a book in a way that it provides the background knowledge that they need in order to answer challenging questions from students, for example? Another consideration that we need to have when it comes to selecting materials is this developmentally appropriate for my students, right? Are they ready for this, developmentally speaking? And this is a more sensitive, right? A conversation, and the truth is that so much of the answer is going to be it depends, and this is not something that is for teachers to decide on their own. This is a time where teachers should be collaborating with the school psychologists, for example, and the school counselors in order to determine what it might be developmentally appropriate for the group, because the truth is that it's going to vary depending on the group, right? So, for example, how are your students individually? What do you know about them, right? What are the unique characteristics? What are their lived experiences? What is the context? What is the political context of the school where you are teaching, right? What what processes and frameworks, what policies do you have at the school that supports the teaching and learning of certain materials? So that is a place where you could collaborate with your I guess again, the school counselor, the school psychologist, administrators, to determine if that material that you're teaching is developmentally appropriate for your students. We also have the role of the process, and I'm just naming this. So much of teaching these materials is not just about providing the information to the students, it's also about how do you teach it, right? How do you build community within your classroom? What kind of routines and rituals do you have that encourage your students to be independent learners, to be critical thinkers, again, to increase that fluidity in their brain, right? What tools and languages do you have in your classroom that supports conversations, asking questions, the notion of psychological safety for students to make mistakes and be supported as they make the mistakes, that encourage dialogues, right? And what kind of guidelines and routines that do you have in place in order to support students' learning, particularly when you're engaging in materials that might be challenging for them? Finally, as a provide an example, we're gonna tell you a few things before we leave about the teaching of a book that I supported a team of faculty in preparing to teach this book for a group of eighth graders, right? So for those who are not familiar with Lillian Duncan, it's a novel it, that we teach at Windward for eighth grade LA students in the eighth grade. And this is a novel that has, where the two main characters are, one is has psychiatric disability, is bipolar disorder, and one student is transgender, right? So something that we did in order to prepare our teachers to think about how to teach this book, because we knew that it had very important information, and information that we needed to make sure that our students were ready to receive. We took into account a few considerations, right? We worked in collaboration with our school counselors, our coordinators, and the DIB office. We developed a protocol that where the information was scaffolded to support teachers in preparing for their students to read this book in a way that was supportive of their growth and learning. So some key considerations that I would invite everybody to take into account in preparing to teach books such as this is, like, of course, first read the text, get very familiar with it. Check for representation and social justice orientation. Again, how are the characters being presented? Are they only being presented from that deficit perspective, or are there moments of joy and empowerment as well? Understand your own positionality. How do you feel about the experiences of the characters in the group? Where do you stand? What's your own positionality? Consider the positionality of your students. Where do they stand? Is there anybody in the classroom that for whom that might be their experience? Consider the necessary background information needed for you and your students, and what do you need to provide ahead of time before starting reading the book? Operationalize the definitions. What definitions and what common ground definitions do you need to create and scaffold for students first? So when they start engaging with the materials, they are ready to understand. Also, think about the school policies and the mission. How does it align with the mission of the school, and what policies and supports do you have in place in order to teach this kind of content? Consider notice, advance notice for families. This is not a requirement, but maybe this is something that you need to communicate, is particularly if you have a close relationship with your families and know that they could benefit from knowing in advance that their students are going to be engaging with these kinds of materials, and evaluate as needed, right? You might have to adjust it from year to year. You might have to adjust it based on who your audience is. And we only have 1 minute left. I wanted to open it up for questions, but I don't see any questions in the chat right now. If folks had any question and wanted to follow up at a later time, I would be happy to read your question if you have any, and you can write it and we can follow up with you later. I don't want you to leave if you have something that you wanted to ask and we haven't had the chance to respond. But in the last minute that we have today, is I wanted to also invite you all to think about some panoramic considerations, right? So we have an invitation for you to think about that you are not alone. You should not be feeling alone in making these decisions. You should take into account the school policies and knowing your community and building those relationships with people in your community. Also think about the clarity of the language and terms. I would invite you to think about the cross-curricular experiences and collaborations that you can build with people in your community, administrators, with other teachers, with your coordinators. What kind of professional development and teacher training do you need to take part in? And the most important part is how do you build those relationships that help you and support you in selecting these materials? Because the truth is that different people will have different lenses, and it's always good to engage with folks that will have different perspectives so you can also keep your own implicit biases in check. And if you can complete this closing routine that says, I used to think and now I think, before you log off, I would really appreciate it, and I would really appreciate your thinking in this. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate you logging in today, and I hope that you all have a really great rest of your evening.